Hello all the crazy people out there, my name is Michael, I like wizards and dragons and making games, and welcome back to writing C++ for use in GameMaker. So today we're going to be talking about DLLs. Last week I made another video on using DLLs in GameMaker and writing some C++ that would compile a DLL that you could use in GameMaker. And it covered pretty much all the basics, data types, passing data types from GameMaker and the DLL back and forth to each other. And today we're going to be doing something that's a little bit more fun, and also a little bit more dangerous in the form of pointers. And I realized that the reason that a number of people use an engine like GameMaker in the first place is so that they don't have to deal with things such as pointers. But if you're sufficiently advanced in your craft, either that or just a little bit insane, which is the group I fall into, you can actually use pointers in DLLs, and you can pass pointers to things to and from GameMaker in the DLL, and you can do all sorts of shenanigans like that. That's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm actually going to start with strings, and I mentioned strings last time. If you want to pass a string to a DLL from GameMaker, you would need it to be a const character pointer, I said, and I guess if you basically want to recreate the show debug message function in a DLL in GameMaker, you could say DLL print something const char pointer message, and then you can go and just throw that message at the standard output over here. And this is a null terminated string. It's a little bit of a antiquated way of doing strings. I believe modern C++ has a number of better solutions to strings, but const character pointers are the ones that GameMaker can talk to at the present moment. We can compile this. I forget if I did that already. We can go into the folder where that's going to be dumped as an output. We can update the extension in GameMaker, because GameMaker, as far as I know, still does not have a reload from source button for extension files, which is very annoying. And we can go and add ourselves a... actually, I don't need to do that. I just need to update one of the existing ones. We can go to the fancy print message over here. And let's see. I can, for one, update the help text. So that's just going to be the text that shows at the bottom of the IDE when you select the function. I can also have it take an input parameter, which is going to be a string. And from here, I can pass it a string, and I can say, oh, I don't know. Null terminated character arrays make the world go round. The opinions presented in this video do not represent those of the producers. And if I were to look up in the console anyway, we can see that that message did indeed get printed to the console, right above hello from GameMaker land. And that's how we might use a string in C++. In practice, if you want to do something with an actual string, you probably want to wrap it in one of these in C++ so that you can do some more useful things to it, but I'm not here to pass judgment on those now. Now, if I were to, let's say, get rid of all this and talk about buffers. I'm going to create a buffer. Buffers are one of the more advanced things that you can do with GameMaker. I did make a series of videos on those a number of years ago. And not a lot has changed since then, but regardless, if you're the sort of person who would click on a video that's about GameMaker and C++ and pointers and that kind of thing, I'm guessing you already know how these work. I'm going to create myself a buffer, and I'm going to give it a size that's going to be something like 65, 536, a nice power of 2. The buffer type is going to be buffer fixed, and the buffer alignment is going to be, let's just make it 1 for now. And with what I'm going to be doing with it, it might make sense to make it 4, but I'm just going to make it 1, because that's what people are used to dealing with most of the time. Let's see, I'm also going to say size is going to be 65, 536, and pass in the size as a variable to the buffer create function instead. Because I probably will be changing this a few times in this video to demonstrate different things, but we'll leave it at that for now. So what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to fill this buffer with just a series of numbers. It's just going to be a boring little sequence of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on until the buffer is full. And the type that I'm going to be writing into them is going to be, let me say our I is going to be equal to 1. And then I'll just say while buffer tell buffer is less than buffer get size buffer. There's any number of ways that you can populate this buffer with this data, but I'm going to just be using a while loop like this. We can say buffer write buffer s32, which is going to be assigned 32-bit integer, and the value is going to be I, and then I++ at the end down here. Now, I want this buffer to actually contain the number of, like this number of 32-bit integers, and this is going to be a bit of a recurring subject in this video, but 32-bit integers are 4 bytes wide each. And allocating a buffer of the size would basically just create a buffer that is only 65,536 bytes in size. And if you tried to fill that with 32-bit integers, you would only have 384, because each of these numbers is going to take up 4 bytes. So I'm going to multiply the size of the buffer by the size of that data type. And that is going to allow us to actually create a buffer with this number of integers in it. The buffer size of function doesn't really get a lot of attention. Sometimes people accidentally use it when they want to use buffer get size instead. The names that GameMaker decided to give this function are a little bit confusing, but anyway, there we have it. So the reason that I used this sequence of numbers to fill this buffer is because we're just going to add them up, and to check our answer, there's a fairly simple math equation that you can use. But I'll get to that later. First, I'm going to go back to C++ land, and I'm going to write DLL, let's say double DLL buffer sum. And this is going to need to take 2 arguments. One is going to be a pointer to the buffer itself. We can say an int pointer to the buffer, and this really should be a const int pointer to prevent unfortunate accidents. And the double length. Would be nice if that could just be an integer itself, but GameMaker would prefer it be a double, so we're going to make it a double. And the way that this is going to work is exactly how you think it is. I'm going to initialize double total equals 0 for, I keep wanting to type var, but for int I equals 0, I is less than length, I++, total plus equals buffer index I, because pointers in C and C++ are fundamentally arrays. Or maybe I should say arrays are fundamentally pointers. And when we're done, return total. And I can recompile this. I can take the compiled DLL, I can put that in the extensions folder, and I can go back to GameMaker land, and I can add this to the extension. So that's going to be fancy buffer sum. And that's going to take a reference to the buffer, and that's going to take the length. It's going to return a double. It's going to take 2 arguments, a string, because it's going to be a pointer to the buffer, and a double for the length. And if I were to say fancy buffer sum with the buffer and perhaps the buffer get size, one might expect this to produce the correct answer, but there's actually a few problems here. One is that the value that's actually stored in this variable is not actually going to be a pointer, it's just going to be an index at the current moment, and this may or may not change in the hazily mid to distant future new runtime. A lot of things, including buffers in GameMaker, are index-based, which basically means that the first buffer that you create is going to have index 0, the second buffer that you create is going to have index 1, and it's just going to count up from there. It's not actually going to return a pointer to that strip of memory that's been allocated. And if you did this, the fancy buffer sum function would just accept a value that is 0, and I don't think I have to tell you that that would give us the wrong answer when you try to get the sum of a buffer starting at memory address 0 in the computer. And in fact, I think given that memory address 0 is a bit of a special location, you may actually just get a complete crash. You might not even get anything to do with garbage data or anything like that. So instead, there's a nice function called buffer get address. And this will actually return an actual pointer to this buffer that you can use. I mentioned this once in a blue moon, but GameMaker does actually have a pointer data type. It's not used for much, and it's not something that you would use actually to like mess with memory addresses in GML. But once in a while, it can be helpful to get the, for example, the address of a buffer, which will return a pointer data type, and you can pass that to the DLL. So there's one other problem with this, and it won't actually result in crash, probably, but let us start by figuring out what the answer to this math equation is going to be. You may or may not be aware of the math equation that I am going to use here, but we can say var expected answer is going to be the result of size times size plus 1, all that divided by 2. If you've taken a pre-calculus class, this may look familiar. It's the sum of numbers from 1 to n. This was invented in the early 19th century by one Charles Friedrich Gauss when he was in, I believe, like 4th or 5th grade because he was bored in class. Actually, there's a couple of versions of that story, but that's neither here nor there. And we can say show debug message. The expected answer is going to be that, and the DLL answer is going to be that. And I really should use the game end function when I'm done with this so that the game window just closes automatically and it doesn't blow up in my face. Alright, so we actually did get a crash here. It does not do that every time. Sometimes it will just spit out a garbage answer. That's cool. If I run it again, will it crash again, or will it spit out a garbage answer again? Nope, we got a different unexpected behavior. So instead of a hang or a garbage answer, we got memory allocation failed, attempting to allocate that number of bytes. Awesome. So, the reason that this is happening is related to why I went out of my way to talk/complain about the size of the buffer versus the number of numbers that can fit in it. So, the actual size of the buffer here is not 65,536. It's going to be, once it's multiplied by the 4 bytes of the size of the signed 32-bit integer, it's going to be something in the realm of 260,000 instead. However, there's still only space for 65,536 signed integers in the buffer, and when we pass the straight-up buffer get size of the buffer to the DLL, the value of this is going to be way bigger than the number of numbers that are actually contained in the buffer, and we're going to be saying for I equals 0, I is less than the size of the buffer, and we are going to be doing a good old-fashioned buffer overrun here, and we're going to be trying to access values that are outside the range of the buffer, and when you do that, all kinds of bad things can happen. As you saw when we ran the game, I said sometimes when I was plotting this out earlier today, you will just get a garbage answer, depending on what is outside the buffer. The first time I ran this, we just got the game hanged, the game hung. It just kept spinning its wheels forever and didn't produce an answer. This time, I see that we actually did get a garbage answer, and the game crashed at the same time, which is, like, super exciting. And there's, let's say, 3 ways that you can deal with this. One of them is very, very bad, and you shouldn't do it, but I'm going to mention it anyway because, well, I know that you guys enjoy it when I mention stuff like that. One of them is going to be when we pass the length of this buffer into the fancy buffer sum function. Instead of saying buffer get size buffer, we can either divide that by buffer size of the data type that's in it, so buffer s32, or we can just use the original value up here before it was multiplied by the size of the 32-bit int in the first place, and this will give us the correct answer. This is probably the preferred way of doing this, assuming... what are you complaining about now? Is there, something else in this game? Interesting. Was it game end that was crashing it? That's fascinating. I have never seen the game end function crash GameMaker before. That's amazing. Anyway, when I do this, the size of the buffer, the size of the array that's expected in C++ land is the size that we think it is, basically, and the DLL buffer sum spits out the right answer. Another way to do it would be to, instead of doing the conversion here, we could do the conversion in the DLL. So we could say, for example, length is divided by equals the size of the integer. And this should also produce the correct answer. This will require a recompile. There's a bit of a cautionary tale to be said when it comes to C++ and the size of data types, but I'll save that for the end. I personally prefer the first solution over here, which is just to like pass in the correct size to begin with, and not have to do the conversion in C++ land over here. But you do you. And there is a third solution, and this is the one that I said is very, very bad, and you shouldn't actually do. But since arrays in C and C++ are fundamentally pointers, this'll work. Don't do it. Visual Studio is like... yeah, Visual Studio is not impressed. Anyway. Let's see, moving on from this, and I'm just going to go back to the normal way of doing things. I didn't actually, like, update the extension in GameMaker land, so I don't have to, like, recompile it or anything. A note about performance. If you're doing something very math-heavy in GameMaker, this is where using DLLs potentially shines the brightest. So let me say, let's write a function GML buffer sum. It's going to take a buffer, and we don't need the length here because we can just get the length of the buffer in GameMaker land. We can also run this. And we can see that we're going to get the correct answer in GML as we got, someone's missing a closed parentheses, as we got from the DLL and from the little math summation. We can see that we got the same answer in all three cases. That's great. However, when it comes to performance, I'm actually going to make this considerably bigger. So let's sum up a million numbers instead. And we can use the get timer function to time our code. That needs to be cast to a string, doesn't it? And that's going to be in microseconds, so I'm going to divide by 1,000 to get it to milliseconds. And we can do something similar with the GML version of the calculation. And we can see how long it's going to take to actually produce this answer. So we're going to be summing up a million numbers. We're going to run the game. And if we scroll up, we can see the answer that we got. Correct answer, correct answer, correct answer. That's great. The DLL was able to do that in 1 millisecond. GML took about 160 milliseconds, which is about 10 frames at 60 frames per second. And if I were to scale this up, let's sum up 10 million numbers. Actually, let's go big or go home. Let's sum up 100 million numbers. We're going to see that the gap between the amount of time that it takes... Oh, you know what? Is that going to be like a problem? That's going to be 400 megabytes. Alright, that shouldn't be a problem. Alright, that indeed took a while to run. Actually, I would say probably most of the time that it took to run that was in allocating the buffer in the first place, but... So it scales linearly, but it feels a lot more dramatic this way. The DLL was able to do that calculation in 120 milliseconds, which, again, it's about, I want to say, maybe 7 frames. The first one, a million numbers, it was able to do in about 1 millisecond. And GameMaker was able to do that in all of 16 seconds, not milliseconds, seconds. So again, it scales linearly, but it feels a lot more dramatic this way. And obviously, if I were to run this in something like the YYC, the gap would close. In this case, GML took about 100 times longer to run the same math that the DLL did, and using that as a benchmark to say that GML is 100 times slower than C++ is dubious at best. Depends a lot on the type of calculation that you're doing, although whatever that happens to be, you're going to find that in any case, DLL is going to be a lot faster than GameMaker. That does come with the caveat that I mentioned at the end of the last video, in that calling the function itself to the DLL does take an amount of time, and using DLLs to calculate simple things probably isn't really going to be worth it. I see the initial step of allocating the buffer was a lot faster this time, and the DLL still did that in 113 milliseconds. That's it's the same. Nothing changed with the DLL, except for maybe the process of calling it slightly. But GML was sped up by about a factor of a little more than 4. And I'm not trying to make GML sound like a bad language or a terrible language or anything because of its speed, but you can see even in the YYC, the equivalent code in written in just plain C++ just will absolutely run laps around GameMaker. Also, indeed, about 400 megabytes is what that took. Now, there was one other thing that I said I was going to mention at the beginning, didn't I? Was it the size of data types? In C++, something like an int can generally be expected to be 32 bits, although that is not necessarily guaranteed by the compiler or by the device that you're compiling to. So that is worth bearing in mind if/when you decide to do something like this. I believe other languages, such as if you were to write a DLL in Rust, for example, the precision of data types such as ints are specified, and I think even languages like Rust will specify the size of the data type in the name, so they'll call integers something like an I32, or doubles like an F64 or something like that. Be careful with that. If you're an experienced C++ developer, you probably already know that. When it comes to buffer overruns, you saw all the nonsense that potentially could happen if you did something with a buffer overrun earlier from the wrong answer to like the game hanging for unknown reasons. It's likely to be even worse if you try to write to a location that's outside the bounds of the memory. So if I were to say buffer I is equal to something, and oh, that's const, isn't it? So I'm not like C++ doesn't like it when you do that, does it? I'll get rid of the const for now. Don't do buffer overruns. It is not a... Buffer overruns do not make the world go round. So, oh, there's one more thing, and I'm not gonna write any like example of what to do with this, but there is one other particular pointer-related function that I mentioned earlier that you can use in a buffer. That is window handle. This has actually been part of GameMaker forever, surprisingly. People have used it to do things such as modify the game window in particular ways. For example, if you were to write an extension that allows the user to drag files from Windows Explorer into GameMaker and have GameMaker respond, you need to write a DLL that will grab the window handle and send that off to a DLL, and then in the DLL you could do things like set what happens when files are dragged onto the game from Windows Explorer and that kind of thing. It's a rather obscure function, but it is occasionally useful. And lastly, and this is falling very much into the realm of things that are not officially supported. Let's say you had a struct like this, and let's say that you, for example, for the sake of argument, passed the struct into the pointer. If you were to show message this, you might notice show message, show debug message, whatever. What are you complaining about now? Line 42. Oh, okay, that's going the wrong way. If you were to check the value of a pointer that you get from a struct, you might notice that it looks an awful lot like an actual memory address, and that's because it is. And it is possible to pass a pointer like this to a DLL. And if you know exactly what the struct is composed of, and how like structs inside GameMaker are laid out in memory, then it is possible for you to actually mess with it in that way. But that is something that is not officially supported. I know a few people who have, and I know a few people who have done some fascinating experiments, let's call them, with structs and pointers and DLLs, but That's not officially supported. That's the sort of thing that could change from under your feet at any moment if GameMaker updates and the way that it handles structs in memory changes. The layout of how it stores structs in memory changes, and then you'd have to go and figure out what the change was, and you'd have to update the code. So I don't think until something like that becomes officially supported that it's something you should actually do. But once again, I know that some of you nerds seem to have a fascination with that sort of information, so don't make me play the For All to clip again.
I can teach you, but I won't be held responsible for what you do with the knowledge.
Yeah, whatever. So I'm gonna end this off here. My name is Michael. I like wizards and dragons and making games. This is probably the last DLL video that I'm gonna make. I can't think of anything that's really, like, particularly interesting when it comes to the intersection of DLLs and GameMaker. I might come back and talk more about other things that you can do with the GameMaker extension system in the future, but regardless, if you want the code for this, or at least the code for the DLL that I wrote, now that there's more of it, I might put this project on GitHub as well. We'll see. Anyway, if you want the code for this, look for the GitHub repository in the video description. If you want to contribute to the channel, I have a Patreon. Links to that can be found in all the usual places. Otherwise, I try to post about 2 game dev videos a week. Is this repository still private? I meant to make it public after the last video went public. I'm bad at that. I try to post about 2 game dev videos a week, 1 tutorial like this, and 1 Let's Make a Game, currently Bullet Hell. I can't wait for that thing to be done. I've been saying it's almost done for weeks now. I hope you all found this useful, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Army Armbuster, DJ Gibbles, Edward Holt, GameMaker, Harold Guidry, Kiexi, Sindra Larson, Squarecrow, The Oz, and Zengerman for supporting these videos. If you want to contribute to the channel, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.